I'm Jana Wong Healy, and I've been a film industry professional for years, having worked in development, production, and distribution for a variety of film studios and companies. I currently teach business communication at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business. I'm here with Stephen Gundel, a professor of film and television studies at the University of Warwick in the UK, a film historian and an expert on Italian cinema. His latest book, Fame Amid the Ruins, Italian Film Stardom in the Age of Neorealism, is now published and available for purchase. As those in the industry know, movie sets are creative places where filmmakers, producers, directors, writers, actors, cinematographers can exhibit their expertise. But they can also be places where arguments can and do erupt. For example, best friends Kevin Costner and Kevin Reynolds embarked on the $100 million movie Waterworld, which turned out to be such a script and logistical nightmare that Kevin Reynolds was either fired or walked off the set with 2 weeks to go in production. The movie was a creative disaster and a box office flop, and the two Kevins are no longer besties. In The Abyss, a James Cameron movie that was almost entirely underwater, production horror stories began early and continued throughout production. Cameron himself almost drowned while directing a scene. After production was over, he said, "I knew this was going to be a hard shoot, but even I had no idea just how hard. I don't ever want to go through this again." And speaking of Cameron, his film Titanic was a huge creative and financial success, but the stories of production crises and budgetary overruns dogged the movie throughout filming and solidified Cameron's reputation as, quote, the scariest man in Hollywood. Clashes concerning budget and production logistics and those involving creative differences between producers, directors, writers, and actors occur on movie sets with regularity. So today, we're going to be discussing the clashes and crises that occurred during Dino's years as a producer. So let's get started. Stephen, what was Dino's attitude towards directors? Did he have a standard way of interacting with them?
Well, it's interesting because I think Dino was a two-faced producer, and by that I don't mean he wasn't sincere, because I think unlike some people in the movie world, he was known for telling it straight. I don't think duplicity was something that he was renowned for, but he had a European face and an American face. And curiously, the American face, I think, was developed in Italy, and the European face was something that he appreciated as a distinctive approach when he moved to the United States. What I mean by an American face or dimension to his activity is that he always thought in terms of spectacle. He wasn't afraid of ambitious projects, of the type that you've described in relation to James Cameron, The Abyss and the Titanic. These are huge, huge projects. And, Dino had many of these large projects, The Bible in the Beginning, War and Peace, King Kong, lots of large scale films that posed all sorts of logistical problems. The European dimension was something that was much more concerned with directors as auteurs, that's to say artists with a creative world of their own. Now, Dino tended to want to intervene much more with the spectacles, in part, of course, because of questions of budget. That films like that, King Kong being the prime example, but there are lots of others, The Bible, The Bounty, Ragtime, and so on, where the films really had to be successful, because if they were going to flop, they were going to flop on a very, very major scale. Artistic films tended to be sort of smaller budget, and Dino certainly had a respect for artistic directors. If he recognized a director as having qualities, artistic qualities that were also recognized by the public, by critics, festivals and so on, then he would tend to back off. I think it's interesting when we think, well, where did Dino intervene? Where did clashes tend to occur? And I don't think there really is a pattern to that. I think we can see clashes over scripts, we can see clashes over budget, we can see clashes over narrative development, over casting, in all sorts of areas. I mean, probably the director with whom he had the most famous series of clashes is Fellini, with whom he worked on two films. La Strada, of course, a very successful film that won an Oscar, brought Fellini to international attention, and he also did The Nights of Cabiria, which was another successful film, and then should have made La Dolce Vita, which in the end was produced by Angelo Rizzoli together with Giuseppe Amato. But that was slated to be a De Laurentiis production, and I think that film, which is regarded as certainly one of the handful of most famous Italian films of the post-war period, huge international success, that really put Fellini amongst those very few directors who are more or less household names, whose names give rise to an adjective, Felliniano in Italian or Fellini-esque in English. But there are lots of clashes, and I mean, let's just mention some of them, and it gives us an idea, I think, of where Dino's concerns were. La Dolce Vita is this sort of ragbag of a film that's meant to evoke Rome in the 1950s, the Hollywood on the Tiber, the fast-changing metropolis, Italy in the post-fascist period, the boom of the world of magazines and the paparazzi and the celebrities and so on. And it's a film that captures the effervescence of that period, but also its dark side. And the dark side, I think it's fair to say, is dominant in the film. Dino was not very keen that dark side should be dominant. He wanted it to have a lighter tone altogether, and in particular there was a long-running dispute with Fellini over one character, and the character bears the name in the film of Steiner. Steiner is an intellectual. He is the reflective presence in the film, and he commits suicide having killed his children. Right? So this was an extremely sort of bleak moment in the film, which for Fellini was absolutely crucial, because it sort of captured almost the death of the intellectual, the eclipse of thought and reflection by sensation and the media. So they argued at length about that, and it was one thing that led to Dino withdrawing. Another dispute was over casting. Dino had in mind for this sort of blockbuster film an all-star cast. He wanted all sorts of, Maurice Chevalier, Henry Fonda. He wanted the lead role of the disenchanted journalist Marcello, who was eventually played by Marcello Mastroianni, Fellini's choice, because at that time Mastroianni was not the great sort of Latin lover figure, but was a sort of ordinary everyman. That's how Fellini saw him. Dino said, no, let's have Paul Newman. We want a big American lead. I mean, it wasn't unusual in Italian films of the 50s to bring in an American star to take the lead role, but this was something that Dino insisted on, because if he was going to invest heavily in a film like this, that after all was capturing, Rome as an international centre, it needed to have a big star to sort of carry it over to the public. Fellini flatly refused, and Dino eventually, withdrew from that project. But interestingly, although we can, find that, and there's also a notorious case, I think, from The Nights of Cabiria, the film Fellini made immediately before La Dolce Vita, where there's a character known as the man with the sack. And the man with the sack is a benefactor who literally has a sack full of foods and medicines and so on that he distributes to homeless people living in the caves. Dino didn't like that episode at all, and in that case, he actually stole the negative from the production center, and so it disappeared from the film. Fellini asked him for it years later for use at a festival or something like that. But these are the sort of disputes that happen that will, they've been evoked in memoirs, biographies of the two figures. But actually, they maintained a good relationship through this. When you were talking about Kevin Reynolds, Kevin Costner, breaking apart, never speaking, certainly not being best friends. I mean, there are examples of nasty disputes involving Dino, but there are also ones where you can see it. There's a sort of an exchange between producer and director that remain within certain limits of civility, let's say, even in the case of the Knights of Kabir and the Man in the Sack, that they maintained a respect for each other.
There were no hard feelings when Dino walked away from the movie, La Dolce Vita?
I don't think so. I think no, because it had been a problematic film. I mean, the project existed for some time, had been discussed and been under development, and Fellini was looking for a producer. Dino put himself forward. There were differences of opinion about the film. Dino withdrew, and then Rizzoli stepped in. And Rizzoli actually had some of the same views as Dino. He thought the film should have a lighter tone, it should have a ray of light in it, he said. But he was in Milan. He was a publisher principally rather than a film producer, and the executive producer on site, Giuseppe or Peppino Amato, actually trusted Fellini. Something that not many producers have done completely, but he trusted Fellini and allowed him the time and the money to develop the film as he wished. But no, I think that the hard feelings tend to arise when there's a sort of a clash which is sort of in a way irreparable. And a film sort of suffers for it. I mean, there are some cases of that in Dino. The dispute with David Lean over The Bounty, which Lean in the end did not direct, like La Dolce Vita, one might say, but it left in that case a bitter feeling. A lot of money had been spent on development. The two were working together for the first time. Big disputes over budget, the scale of the film, its purpose, and so on. Disputes also with Robert Altman, which I think have a nasty tone to them. But with Fellini, no. I think there was always that sort of respect. They'd sort of emerged onto the international scene together, and right up until Fellini's death in the early 90s, they maintained good relations.
What happened with David Lean? He's noted for making such large epic movies, and there's something about making movies in water that seems to be a problem with a lot of directors. So what happened? Was it logistical, basically, which caused the budget to go up, or was it more creative differences?
Well, you're absolutely right about films involving water, because there are a few of those in Dino's career. There's Orca, there's the Hurricane. The Bible in the beginning has floods, and of course all sorts of storms and so on, marking the beginning of the world. And so on. So there are actually a surprising number. And water films, they do pose particular problems of logistics, of costs. You've got to build a ship if you've got the Bounty, or for that matter Noah's Ark. You've got to build the thing, and then you're reliant on the weather. Of course, I mean that's another thing that can lead to a lot of time wasting, and you've got to transport a crew, cast to remote place quite often. I think with David Lean and the Bounty, David Lean is sort of known, I suppose, best remembered for his larger scale films rather than some of the smaller ones, Dr. Zhivago and so on, probably ones that the public remember best. And I think the collaboration, it was, Dino began with a lot of respect for David Lean, and there was the aspiration to make a masterpiece from the beginning. But there were, all sorts of location problems involving New Zealand, Fiji. There was also the question of, I think, the identity of the film, because this was actually the fifth movie version of The Bounty. And therefore it was perceived in the public mind as a remake. The best known one, of course, is the 1935 version with Clark Gable in the role of Fletcher Christian, the leader of the mutineers, and a number of other sort of prominent cast members. That's the one people remember. But the aim here was actually not to do a remake. It was to sort of to tell the true story, because it's not fiction. I mean, this is a factual story, and that the dynamics of the historical account are actually rather different to those which have been popularized through the 1935 film. For example, the fact that Captain Bligh and Fletcher Christian in reality were quite sort of close, and it's the deterioration of their relationship which is part of the explanation for the mutiny. So the aim was to show that, and it was a film also with an absolutely incredible cast. I mean, if we think Mel Gibson was playing Fletcher Christian, Anthony Hopkins was playing Captain Bligh, and you also had in the cast, Daniel Day-Lewis, Liam Neeson, and a number of other people. But the budget went completely out of control. And I think, Dino was not somebody, I mean, we can identify films, I think, where he was present on set, was, very hands-on. Others where he wasn't so much. He's in his office getting his reports, and sort of, following things at a distance. And I think here he probably trusted Lean to do things correctly. Lean, the sort of English gentleman, of course, very tall and straight, well spoken, and so on. Came across as absolutely reliable. But the truth was that they didn't get on, and in fact, what happened was that having invested a lot, having got the ship built and so on, replaced David Lean with an Australian director, Roger Donaldson, who actually made the film. And Donaldson, of course, along with a number of other directors, like the director of King Kong and so on, were regarded as sort of artisan figures, who had to do what they were told. So the film took a different sort of turn, and didn't, I think it sort of did reasonably well, but didn't sort of make its money back at the box office.
I would think that the combination of Robert Altman and Dino De Laurentiis would be very spicy.
Well, Buffalo Bill is one of those films which, or Buffalo Bill and the Indians, to give it its proper title. It's, because I think the interesting thing also about these disputes is, how do we get to know about them? You were saying in your opening about, there are stories of production problems, disputes, and so on. And basically there are a lot more disputes than we know about. Some of them may be arguments, discussions, which are resolved amicably, others not. We tend to know about them if either they finish up in the press because of the scale of a project or the length of time it's taking to move from the idea through to full realization, or we learn about them afterwards through memoirs and interviews given sometimes many years later. And certainly we know a lot more about the disputes between De Laurentiis and Fellini now than was known in the 50s and early 60s. But sometimes they're also used to create publicity around a film. Public interest is sort of stimulated by stories of disputes, just as stories of exploding budgets. You think these are horror stories, but the public thinking, wow, hundreds of millions of dollars. I must see this film. And that the budget question in promotion is still there today. I think large figures are sort of shot out there, meant to impress the public, wow the public. Robert Altman, I think, was a director, an American director, who Dino looked at as a sort of European auteur. And I think Altman saw himself in that sort of way too. I mean, there are disputes, I think, all along the line, beginning with the script through to the casting. It's one of the few films. Dino always insisted, as the director, that he should have the right to the final cut. But he very rarely exercised that. I think the case of him sort of stealing this episode of The Man with the Sack, stealing the negative, is a sort of quite a rare case of him having not quite a sort of ghostly final cut, if you like. But he did exercise that with Buffalo Bill and the Indians, following previews, because he and Altman argued. They argued about the length of the film, about the pace of it, and Dino took the film out for preview. It got a rather poor reaction from the public, which Dino shared with Altman. Altman wasn't interested. He didn't want to change anything. So in the end, he did exercise that cut before it got released. But interestingly, the film was shown in its full version at the Berlin Film Festival, where it won the Golden Bear. Oh. And the Golden Bear Award was given specifically by the jury to the full-length version. And you can imagine, Dino was absolutely, furious at that. So it's only the Robert Altman, the director's cut, if you like, that won the prize. Not the film as was, released in the cinemas worldwide.
You mentioned Milos Forman and his direction of Ragtime. I've always thought he was a pretty placid, easygoing director. Did he have issues with Dino about budget, or was it more creative differences between those two?
Well, you're right. I mean, for because Ragtime, it was originally going to be directed by David Lean. This was talked about earlier on, because Dino loved the novel, Doctorow's novel, Ragtime, bought the rights up sort of more or less straight away. After what happened with The Bounty, of course, Lean was out of the picture and Milos Forman was brought in, and their relationship was a good one. We don't actually have very many records or examples of dispute there, but I think there were issues, and we can sort of see that behind the scenes there probably were arguments going on. For example, the casting of the film, I think, was quite evidently problematic, and there's sort of the prominent role given to James Cagney, for example, who at this point was very old, had not been in a picture for a long time, but he was not only given a significant role as a policeman. One might think, looking at him on screen, that should have been long retired, but he was also sort of sent round the world to do the promotion. I can remember seeing him on the Michael Parkinson show, which was a Saturday evening chat show, and he was not really able to engage with the host. He was that sort of old, I would say, and that didn't help. The film, despite the novel having been an enormous bestseller, got a rather lukewarm response, and Dino certainly felt that he gave Forman too much freedom, over how the novel should be condensed for the screen, and the tone as well. This question of, should it have a lighter tone or a darker tone? I think Dino would have preferred a lighter tone, a more positive view of American history than the film actually conveys. It's interesting that it got 9 Oscar nominations and won none.
Oh.
So, it's not a film that sort of, left anybody feeling very happy, I think, although it's not a bad film at all.
I remember seeing it in the theater, but I don't have much memory about it. And I read the book before I saw the movie, and I just remember it being very expansive, a cast of thousands. And so, um, was there a pattern to these clashes? I mean, Dino is in the center of all of them, and he seems to care very much about story, as we have learned in previous podcasts. Is that the main um, reason for some of these clashes, do you think? Or are there other things involved?
I I think if we, because in a way we're talking about creative clashes principally, even if there are issues of budget, um, and so on. I mean, I think there are also business clashes, um, which involve, in particular, Dino's historic collaborator, Carlo Ponti, who, of course, also became an international producer, in his own right, a husband of Sophia Loren, whose career he guided. But the two of them collaborated very closely in Italy up until 1955, and they sort of really fell out over their approach to cinema. Dino's sort of concern with spectacle, his ambition, his international view, clashed with that of Ponti at the time, which was much more concerned with the national market and low budget films that would go over well with the mass public, particularly in the south of Italy, which was going to the cinema for the first time. So we can find in that relationship clashes. We can find clashes with big studios who are financing some of the films. I mean, I think sort of the Bible in the beginning, directed by John Huston. I mean, was originally going to be a Columbia Pictures project, but they wanted sort of to intervene and control to such an extent that Dino felt he was being treated, like an employee, a bureaucrat, and so Columbia went out of the picture. Dino raised the finance independently and took control of it. But if we look at the creative clashes, then I think we have to bear in mind that Dino was a great reader. When he thought about the public, he always thought about stories. You know, who should tell the stories? How should they be told? What actors should be used to convey the characters? So actually, some of the sharpest disputes, which don't really interest the public very much, and tend therefore not except in memoirs to sort of to finish up really in the public realm, were those over script. Certainly, writers, even going back to the Italian days, Ugo Pirro, famous and very productive screenwriter, always said that Dino intervened very heavily in the script phase. He would give directions, he would very clear ideas about, what was a good idea to have in a film and what was not, about the pace, about how novels should be condensed for the screen. In that sense, I think, we can say, yes, that's the core. And if then we find disputes over, the different episodes, whether they should be there or not in sort of later films, like the Man with the Sack example, to come back to that, for example, it's all really to do with the narrative shape of the film, that and most films, of course, have a very tightly written script before shooting starts. Fellini is well known for not sticking to script, and that's how the dispute arose. But I think we can see that I think Dino never really had a dispute with the public. I don't think he ever sort of berated the public for not embracing one of his films. If he tended to take responsibility himself if a film didn't work, but he did on occasion tackle critics. If the critics were mean or they misjudged a film. If you think he also made a film with Ingmar Bergman, The Serpent's Egg, which was not well received by critics, and Dino took out press ads to sort of state the case for the film. So he responded very forcefully. But I think we can see, in his nature, in his personality, in his way of working, you know, I think disputes were par for the course. There weren't, we're not talking about a studio with a structure, with committees and procedures and so on, whereby disputes will be ironed out, and so on. They tended to be sort of tackled directly. It's these sort of face-to-face clashes which marked Dino's career. But because he was a public persona himself, I mean, the producer is always the bad guy in a way. Not seen as creative, seen as solely interested in budget, no sense of art. This is the stereotype of the producer. And so, Dino tends to get a bit of a bad press when it comes to some of these disputes, even if they're in memoirs. But because he was a personality, he could defend himself and people could see his passion for cinema. And I think that's recognized by the directors he worked with, even those he fell out with, that he had a passion for cinema. He had an understanding of the public, but also an appreciation of art as well. And I think that meant that there are actually quite few of these cases where dispute was so sharp and so nasty as to leave a bad taste in the mouth.
Well, I just love the fact that it seems that most of the times that he clashed, it was over story. And he was really, to him, story was everything. We've learned that in his biography and some of the podcasts that we've already done. He cared so much about story. And that's one thing that I think a lot of producers have lost in recent times, is the aspect of the story, how important the story should be. And so I love that about Dino's work.
Yes, I think you're right. We can see, some blockbusters of more recent times where, you're not quite sure where the story has gone. um, I don't think Dino would ever have made films like that.
No, I don't. Well, thank you, Stephen. This is great. It was really informative and interesting. And story is everything, I guess we're learning from Dino after all these sessions.
Hmm.
So, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I think we've pretty much covered that topic, but I suspect we will continue to learn, more because, as I mentioned, it is through memoirs and through interviews, through biographies that we really get insights into some of these production histories of films. And so I suspect as the years go by, we will learn more than we know at the moment.
Well, thanks, Stephen. Until next time.